Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the second Dead Hour Dialogue this year. We're gathered this afternoon to celebrate the publication of a recent book by an esteemed historian who is also one of the professors in our department. Ping Yao is an exceptional scholar and teacher. She's a known specialist, having served on several area and national advisory councils and editorial boards of numerous journals. She's also been awarded many prestigious, highly competitive national and international awards and grants. Among a very long list of honors at Cal State LA, she was named Distinguished Woman and also Outstanding Professor. Professor Yao, I wanted to show off your wonderful career in scholarly publications, but I admit I got tired counting the number of books. I stopped at about 10 books. There's a lot more. There's also a lot of journal articles, book chapters, and translated works in Chinese, Japanese, and English. So I'm going to stop myself now before I end up taking the rest of our time today. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you Professor Ping Yao, whose book was just released. It's the perfect timing also because its publication allows us to remember that it's March, it's Women's History Month. Professor Yao's book carries the title Women, Gender, and Sexuality in China, A Brief History, published by Routledge Press. My name is Dr. Lee in the History Department, and I've got also with me co-hosting today's book launch, Dr. Chuli Fun from AAAS, Asian American and Asian Studies program. So Dr. Yao, thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy day to talk with us. I was hoping to be able to begin this meeting today by sort of talking a little bit broadly about what your book is. It's such an amazing resource for students, right? It's not just aimed at specialists. It's very accessible, it's concise, it brings thousands of years of Chinese history into a 200-page book. The chapters are organized thematically to show change over time, walking readers through each of these topics. And here I just want to call attention to the table of contents that I provided on this screen share. So I'm looking at the numbered chapters here. You've got a section on life courses and gender roles, marriage and family, another chapter on sex, body, and medicine, one on labor, profession, and everyday life, religions, arts, literature, and education, and then a final chapter with some very exceptional stories about 5 particular women that you call 5 Women to Remember. So I wanted to ask Dr. Yao, what one message do you hope readers would get out of this book?
What my goal of this book was to show that there are rich stories to tell and a lot to learn about women in Chinese history than just the practices of foot binding, concubinage, or the domestic seclusion or social inferiority of women. And I also wanted to show that we have 40 years of scholarship and incredibly rich sources to prove that point. So did I answer your question?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I was wondering if I could actually follow up with this. And I wanted to also share a little bit about my interaction and my relationship with Dr. Yao. So Dr. Yao was actually my professor. I know she probably started teaching when she was 10, right? And one of the things that I love about her many books is the accessibility, but particularly with this book, what I find is that what I love about it is that it is designed specifically for an undergraduate course, right? And rather than just scholars in the fields. And I think oftentimes those who do not have the language skills find some of these sources inaccessible to them, right? So we have epitaphs that, until Dr. Yao had translated them, they were not available in English. We have poems between a husband and wife. We have policies. We have biographical writings. We have Taoist hagiographies. We have the kind of sources that I think oftentimes are only, accessible to scholars of the field. So the fact that, Dr. Yao has made this available to undergraduates, I think something is really wonderful. And so with that in mind, I wonder if you can elaborate, Dr. Yao, on what Kitya had asked, and for the undergraduates here to think about the kind of takeaways that they might have from the way that you curated the primary documents of this book.
Yeah, excellent question. What I really hope for the readers to get out of it is for them to be inspired by the types and the genres of sources available for historical research, because especially for gender history, where women's voices were often muted. And I was also very aware, since I'm in the field for so many years, almost 30 years. So I was very aware of the fact that the Western scholars often focus on the sources that are easily accessible to them to study Chinese history. So you can see that the scholarship on gender in early China was centered on Taoist concept of yin and yang, because they're available. While scholarship on gender in late imperial China centered on literature and women's writings. So what I try to show is that you can find filial piety toward a mother in early China, like 10th century BCE, by a son's dedication of a bronze vessel to his mother. And you can also find the marital tension throughout Chinese history by looking into legal cases, which is like started from the Qing dynasty, 3rd century BCE, up to the Qing Qing dynasty, which is from 17th century to early 20th century. So I hope after reading these primary sources, then reader will contemplate on, say, how the availability and unavailability of certain types of sources influenced the way we conduct our research and the topics we pick. And what I really wanted to get out of it is also that they will go on to explore what other sources we can find and in what ways they would enrich our understanding of the subject and research topic. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
That's so interesting. I love hearing about the primary sources. Could I ask you to tell us a little bit more about the conditions of the sources themselves, where you got the materials from, and in any cases, if they were archival or original materials, if you could just talk about, I don't know, the materiality of the sources, things like that, about the conditions, the physicality.
Yeah, great question. I actually, I'm kind of sort of considering especially the materiality of the documents. My primary sources are mostly based on texts that are already transcribed by Chinese scholars. Mm-hmm. So what I did was just translate the transcribed texts. I didn't go to any archives. I used Chinese scholars' research in archives. So I'm kind of like, it's primary sources, but it's kind of secondhand primary sources. Yeah, the conditions and materiality of sources are certainly very important. Actually, on the Sunday, I'll present a paper at the Asian Studies Annual Conference on the materiality of Tang Dynasty epitaphs. What I found was that during the 7th century, epitaph sizes were parallel to the dead person's official rank. So if you're high ranking official, your epitaphs would be bigger. And for women of the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century, it was one size smaller than that of their husbands. But later on, during the 9th century, you would find that there's a mismatch between sizes and official ranks. And so they largely ignored the rules of the early Tangs. And I argue that this was especially true among epitaphs for daughters who died young. So I wanted to show that this trend actually reflects the influence of Buddhist concepts of death, and especially the concept of purgatory. Because when everyone was to be judged equally upon entering the netherworld, then every death would be equally important. So they just want to make sure their daughters and sons had a, good death in a way.
Make sure they get to the right place, right?
So exactly. I did not use archival documents, but I wanted to use some paintings from museums, but unfortunately I didn't get a chance. I mean, I never got the permissions from Chinese museums. I have some photos. Do you think I can show them?
Oh, that would be great. The share screen is available if you wouldn't mind popping it up.
Okay, so so this is let me do, how do I?
Slideshow.
Here. Right, so this is a silk document written on silk paper, and show that female association bylaws. I wanted to show that these actually names signed as a members, it's called a female association or women's association, but the names signed here are actually men. So I assume they're husbands, members' husbands. But look at these symbols. These are the marks by the association women themselves to show that I'm here, I approve this message. So this is what you call the, additional added signs. I want to show, this is actually a detail of it. Okay, this picture, I did not get the approval, permission. I wanted to, it was in the Spring Warring States period from 5th century to 3rd century BCE. The earliest painting of yin and yang, this is yin, this is yang, men riding a dragon and women riding a phoenix. But if you look carefully, this is the moon, she is standing on a moon. So early painting already show the sign of yin and yang, moon and the sun. And then these paintings are from Peking Palace Museum, commissioned by Emperor Yongzheng of 12 beauties. What's interesting about these paintings is because even though Yongzheng, we all know, Manchu emperors, they had different attires and hairstyles, but Yongzheng as a Manchu emperor actually worshipped beauty of Han Chinese women. So he commissioned 12 paintings, and this is 3 of them, and they are collected in a Peking Palace Museum, which I did not get the permission. And then also this one, I talked about women in art, and by early 20th century, Chinese women were studied abroad, and they had a more sort of agency, portraying themselves as self-portrait and then nudity, and the paintings are, instead of describing like courtyard, flowers and everything, they described social scenes and then outside the world. So no archive materials, but museum pieces, but I didn't get permission. That's what I wanted to say, unfortunately. So.
That's so beautiful. Matisse,
Yeah,
your heart out.
yeah. Fortunately, also the publisher would not accept any low resolution images, so I was not able to include a lot of good ones, but I was able to kind of put the link to the museum sites. So if you read the footnotes, endnotes, you will see, you can find out where to get them. So.
It's so wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
One of the things that I found most interesting, I think generally, as someone who also studies gender, is not just the relationships between men and women in terms of their unions, but what actually happens if those unions fall apart. And so for me, one of the things that I found most interesting is actually the section on divorce. And I think most people, myself included, because I'm not a specialist of China, that what I found really interesting is that, like, you know, most people think of this as kind of a modern, during the Republic or even during communist China, that divorce was available to women, right? But one of the things that I found most interesting is actually during the Tang period and in the codes, right, is that there was a provision that allowed for mutual dissolution of a marriage. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this era, and talk a little bit about why in some ways it seems more egalitarian than even during the modern period, because even today it's something that's really stigmatized, right? Divorced families, I mean, not just in China, but actually even in the Western world, that this is something that is very stigmatized. And if you could talk a little bit about this code, talk a little bit, maybe a little bit about the period too, and why this was possible.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's my favorite period, because I study Tang Dynasty women. Yeah, it's quite unique. I think probably because the ruling clan, prior to the establishment of the Tang Dynasty, the ruling clan had long intermarried with the nomadic clan, the Turks, the Toba tribe. So Tang women always had a higher status than women of later periods, for sure. You would not find dowries in the Tang Dynasty. Afterwards, you would find women needed a dowry to marry into a man's family, and foot binding did not exist during the Tang Dynasty, right? Divorce was not uncommon during the Tang Dynasty, and the princesses divorced multiple times. And from my reading of 6,000 Tang Dynasty epitaphs, I found records of multiple marriage, remarriage, both men and women. So it was just not stigmatized, but it became really stigmatized after the Tang. And I give an example, basically right after the Tang, I give an example in the book about the Song Dynasty, which is from 960 to 1279. There was a woman in the eastern part of a county, Shandong province, I think, who's sued for divorce. She accused her husband being stupid, and her her father-in-law of sexual harassment. So the local judge granted a divorce only because she looked down upon her husband and insulted her father-in-law, which meant she was not a filial daughter-in-law. So, but her divorce petition was granted, but she got 60 beating as a punishment for accusation against her father-in-law. So you can see that, after the time, divorce was definitely a shameful thing to initiate. Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. Can I ask some more questions about these kind of this intersection of gender and gender identification and sex? I guess here I'm wondering sort of about some other attitudes about that relationship. So now I'm going to look at my copy of the book and read a little excerpt, if you'll indulge me. So you write on page 70, female bodies are related to male bodies in a homologous relationship. The fluidity of yin and yang would become the basis of medical treatment throughout Chinese history, to the extent that some medical texts suggest that a fetus could change its sex in the womb. The passage goes on to talk about how the fetus had been transformed into a boy who then became an emperor and is said to have a female voice as a result of that transformation. So what I find so interesting, since I'm not a specialist in East Asia and Chinese history, but I read a lot about sort of other parts of the pre-modern world. And I find that in a lot of global societies until the 18th century, they did not consider sex to be a fixed permanent matter, right? But something that was in sort of fluid and could be plural. So I wonder, could you talk a little bit more about this? And I was hoping maybe you might connect it to one of the primary sources that you include in the book. I think it's the one that's entitled Buddhist Perception of Non-Duality. Would you read the poem and explain sort of the perspective? And I think this is a Ming era document, right? So if you could kind of talk about how peoples at the time thought of this relationship.
So in chapter 3, right? Sex and sexuality. Yeah. Yeah, this is a poem written by a Buddhist nun. She actually went on to be a very influential figure and gave sermons and everything because of her idea about this non-duality. People called her one-eyed Jinggang, one-eyed nun, because she meditated, contemplated so much, and read the sutras so carefully and seriously, and one of her eyes lost vision. So, right, this is a poem composed by a Buddhist nun from late 16th century and early 17th century. It reads, male or female, why should one need to distinguish false and true? What is the shape of which Guanyin would finally take form? Because Guanyin at first was male and then later on became female in the 10th century. When it was Guanyin was India Bodhisattva when it was introduced to China in the 3rd century, but eventually became a female figure. So she said, what is the shape in which Guanyin would finally take form? And peeling away the Bodhisattva skin would be of no use whatsoever. And were someone to ask if it were the body of women or that of a man. So I think for Buddhism, the world is an illusion, and therefore the ultimate reality and the ultimate being are not what we have observed. We're not too sure what you see is actually what whether it's actually true. I think some modern philosophers actually connect Buddhism to quantum physics, which I have no idea about, but there's some connection somewhere there. Therefore, in this nun's argument, reality is an illusion. Illusion is a reality. So neither male or female. So that's Buddhist idea. But interestingly, as you mentioned, yin and yang in early reading, for a long time, from like the earliest possible, from the foundation of Taoist religion and philosophy, yin and yang are not fixed entities at all. So yin and yang can be considered as a internal space-time structure in a lived body. And in this body, yin and yang mark points in relations across spectrums. You know, at certain point, yin became yang, and at certain point, yang would become yin as well. So the same element can be in female in a certain relation, but yang and male in another. So in this sense, both religions actually contributed to the idea of gender fluidity in Chinese concept of toward the sex.
Well, I think
I
that
don't know if I answered the question.
Yes, yes.
at least for me, Ping, that explained the space-time continuum of gender fluidity and Buddhism to me. Not that I know much about, you know, quantum physics or quantum mechanics. I wanted to follow up with that because, like, for me, it is always very interesting the kind of relationships that kind of sit on the margin, right? And seemingly that the idea of same-sex relationships was actually not something on the margin, right? What you're saying. And even today, what we call modern society in the United States, no less than China or any other country globally, that this idea of same-sex relationships is ignored, right? Or it's illicit, or it's banned or criminalized either by de jure or even by de facto. And one of the things that struck me about your section about same-sex relationships is that it didn't pose a threat on Confucianism.
No.
Because of the idea of shu. And one, can you explain that? And just speak a little bit about Confucianism so that folks in this room that may not be familiar with it can understand and put that in context. And that it's really, in fact, because of these like Western influences that actually curtails this kind of gender fluidity that you're talking about, right? And then do you think that maybe Buddhism and Taoism have something to do with the way that they're viewed? Because, well, I don't know, I'm not the specialist. So that's my vague question.
Yeah, excellent question. Whether I really have to think about it, whether Taoism and Buddhism influence Chinese people's attitude toward same-sex relationship. I at this point I haven't read anything about it. So, but this is a great topic. Maybe I should ask some of my students in Chinese history class to consider. But I want to first mention that I made a mistake in my textbook. I really have to apologize for claiming that same-sex relationship was criminalized during the PRC era from after 1949. That's actually not true. Before 1979, gays and lesbians were jailed and charged, but they were charged under the crime of hooligan, not same-sex relation. So I did not know until Professor Li Huaying of UT Austin, who actually used this textbook for his Chinese history class, and the class collectively found out about it. So the crime was hooligan, not same-sex relationship. Yeah, for Confucian idea of shu, which means benevolence, tolerance, means don't impose on others what one does not desire. So, so in that sense, they're quite tolerant. And also Chinese literati would leave these relationships alone as long as it did not threaten the family, right, or kinship. Also, scholars suggest that the same-sex love can be an emotional outlet for married literati, could be a dependable contraception, and also an option for a male individual to satisfy his sexual desire. And actually, throughout Chinese history, standard history, we call it the history of previous dynasties, written by scholars of the next dynasty at the commission of the emperor. So we have 24 dynastic histories. 23 of these dynastic history described in a very positive tone about homosexual relations especially between the emperor and his lovers, until the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty history, that the book was written by now modern scholars, influenced by the Western ideals about homosexuality. So this chapter was eliminated from the Qing dynasty history. So that's how it changed. Did I answer your question?
Could I want to ask a couple of another question actually, to sort of connect this discussion about gender, but I want to sort of move into some other sections of the book. So you make a statement in a chapter about labor, profession, and everyday life. And I was really kind of interested in this because it talks about one of my favorite topics, food. You write, food is where gender, class, and power intersected. And I thought that was a very sort of strong and powerful statement to make. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more, particularly here, about this convergence of food with social hierarchies and power, authority.
Yeah, excellent question. I actually feel really strongly about this statement. Because I probably mentioned this to you guys before. When I was in China, my field is ancient China, bronze vessels and ancestor worship and everything. It's from the earliest period to the Han Dynasty, which is 2nd century BC, 3rd century BCE. And in early China, I found the sources to show that and sacrifice for ancestor worship were prepared for women, but they were excluded from the rituals. And then after the ceremony, right, the host would distribute the meals allegedly for the ancestors, but actually for the participants of the ritual, right? So this way, the structure of food distribution during these ceremonies was definitely structured to resemble the social hierarchy and the power structure. So that's one example from the earliest period. And then in later period, I found family, instructions written by the head of household, men, of course, they would particularly mention that wives should not be permitted to sit with the family for meals. So even when I grew up, I saw some families, having meals together, but the wives stay in the kitchen and just bringing the food, So, and that in terms of class, this is a little bit about class as well, but in terms of class in poor regions, it's especially very clear because, probably because poor families, when food was hard to come by, and the men's labor was crucial for the survival of the entire family. So men would have priority to accessing food, but not women. So, and I wish I would have more space to expand this section in the book. Maybe I probably should write a book about it. But the book was already too long for the publisher. They said it has to be, was it 100,000 words? I think I stretched to 106. So I have to cut down a lot. But this is a great topic. Maybe we can do a comparative studies of food and gender and class.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I also wanted to ask one last question, because I also I love also food. Just finished my chapter on food, and like your section on labor profession and the everyday, that was one of my favorite sections. And as we all know, that in many ways women labor in other ways too, right? And I think as a historian of medicine and public health, I find it very fascinating the way that we understand quote unquote pre-modern societies. Although, there are some scholars, myself included, would say that we've actually never been modern, right? And one of the things is that, how were women's reproductive health, both for fertility and then also cessation of fertility, right? What scholars and what the documents say about that. And I love that you included Tan Yun-hsien. Did I pronounce that?
Yes.
Okay. Her autobiography and her history. And why did you choose her? And are there lots and lots of scholarship about women healers? And then on top of that, is there more scholarship that needs to be done on women healers? Because I feel like this is not something that we hear about very often. And then especially most of Western worlds, their relationship to Chinese doctors, it is not a woman that is at the forefront of this. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And that's my last question, I promise.
But that's a wonderful question. I know it's near and dear to your heart. I pick Tan Yun-hsien for several reasons. One is her period, right? I wanted to mention, I want to have an early, I have 5 biographies. So the earliest will be the Shang Dynasty, from the 13th century BCE. Then I want to have the Han Dynasty women, and then Tang Dynasty women. And then, so Tan Yun-hsien was in the 14th century in the middle, and then modern revolution, women revolutionaries. Tan Yun-hsien was also interesting because she learned all her medical skills from her grandmother, right? Mm-hmm. So you can say there's a tradition of female healers and the doctors. And also she left by autobiography, right? It's so precious. And then also she diagnosed, the practice was different from men, right? Men would just, basically examine your, what do you call this, pulse, But she talked to women. She felt that in order to cure a patient, you should know her family background, her life experience, and everything. So she particularly was interested in female patients because she felt like a man could not, cure women well enough. So, which I think I remember, I was very proud of myself when I wrote, she brought medicine to women, women to medicine. So yeah, it's just very amazing doctor. Yeah, there's so many female healers. Actually, in the Han Dynasty, I think the book mentioned that in the palace, there was an office specifically designated for female doctors.
Wow.
And then, yeah, so there was a tradition throughout Chinese history, but we didn't study enough, this topic. So Julie, I count on you to write a book after your first book published by, is it University of Hawaii, about women healers in Chinese history. Julie.
We'll see about that. I don't think that
you were my student. I assign you a homework.
Yeah, I aspire to also have a 12-page CV, just like Ping's. With that being said, Kitty and I have been talking for quite some time, and I think this might be actually a good time for us to actually open it up to other students and scholars to talk to Dr. Yao about her work, and to maybe ask more questions, and then, maybe if you've read it already, to talk about how wonderful and fabulous this book is. And so let's open it up and see if there's any questions for Dr. Yao.